But today is our last poly ed for the summer program. It's week 10, and so today we're going to be talking about what is escalation, the past Palestine national movement, and end off with revolutionary optimism. Okay, so starting with some Palestine updates to ground us as usual. I'm sure we've all seen like the escalation of Zionist aggression on the ground, especially in the Mawasi camp. So in the early morning hours, the Zionist state committed a massacre in al-Mawasi, Khan Yunis. At present, an estimated of 1 million Palestinians are sheltering in the targeted area, which is densely populated with displacement tents. The Zionist occupation murdered at least 40 people and injured 60, numbers that are expected to increase sharply in coming hours as more becomes clear about the full extent of the atrocities. The Zionist state dropped at least four US manufactured 2,000-pound bombs on tents in the so-called humanitarian zone or safe zone, as we know that, as usual, the Zionist state consistently violates these claims that these are safe zones, which house displaced Palestinians. The sheer force of the bombs caused 20 tents to immediately disintegrate and left behind craters at least 30 feet deep at the site of impact. Rescue teams are working tirelessly to dig through mounds of sand and rubble, attempt to locate any remaining signs of life as Iowa warplanes continue to buzz dangerously overhead. Um, and yeah, I'm sure we've all seen, videos coming out of the ground of just these atrocities and all of the children being pulled out. And so it's important that we, understand the weight of the genocide every day. I know it's easy to get desensitized to it, but just keeping in mind of our positionality in the belly of the beast and that there are people who are experiencing these atrocities and just imminent danger at all times of the day and night. And so we can move on to resistance updates in the same way that we center, Palestinians on the ground who are suffering. We also understand that their resistance is necessary. And so resistance fighters are engaged in fierce clashes right now across the West Bank, confronting live bullets and explosive devices. It is jihad of victory of martyrdom. And so Saraya al-Quds, which is part of the Tukram Brigade, said that, and kill them wherever you overtake them and expel them from wherever they have expelled you, confronting the enemies in order to confront the enemy's invasion of the West Bank. Our fighters targeted an infantry force that had barricaded itself inside a house on the clinic axis in Nur Sham's camp and showered them with blessed bullets, achieving direct hits. Our fight is ongoing and our weapons are drawn in all arenas. And the horror of camps, Saria al-Quds, the brigade, they said all of this on Tuesday. And so it's important that we understand that, like, right now, the only thing that is fighting back against the occupation is the resistance. And it's really amazing how the axis of resistance and like the resistance on the ground in Palestine is, despite their conditions, continuing to resist. And then just as some general updates, community updates, obviously we had a heat wave last week and it's just really, really hot outside, causing consistent wildfires around the LA area and South SoCal. It's just important that we find ways to keep each other safe. There's this organization called Water Drop LA and Frontline Medics. They're community-based orgs that engage in mutual aid while understanding the violence and displacement under extreme weather conditions. And it's really important that we, show our support. We also have mutual aid every Friday that will be continuing with the school year. But obviously the conditions right now are really like difficult for people on the street. So it's recommended to bring frozen water bottles and just like cold drinks to mutual aids and then, getting involved with different organizations in order to keep people safe in the heat. A lot of our folks who we know who are unhoused neighbors are experiencing a lot of really difficult conditions right now. Like they don't have like they're experiencing a lot of like medical and like skin conditions because of the heat and because of like the sun. So let's just keep that in mind. And then here we have just like a little guide on staying safe in the heat and protecting ourselves and protecting pets as well from excessive heat. Okay. We can start with check-ins, saying our name, pronouns, And you can also use a nickname or like an alias if you feel more comfortable. And then the question is, what is your favorite meal and do you have a memory associated with it? And like especially keeping in mind that right now Palestinians in Gaza and just like on the ground are experiencing food like famine and not able to access the food that they need to survive and just keeping that in mind as we answer this question. But yeah, let's all check in. You can unmute or you can send it in the chat and I can read it out loud.
Hey everybody, I'm Gene, he, him pronouns. I feel like ever since I graduated from UCLA, I've just kind of I don't know, I just kind of eat to sustain myself and my health. It's hard out here. I don't cook for, so I don't really have a lot of options. I guess when I go out to eat, I like to get vodka pasta, and if I have the money, add lobster to it, because it's really good. There's this spot called Elefante in Santa Monica that I like to go to. So yeah.
That sounds really good. I don't eat lobster, but that sounds really good. Um, Monica said, pronounce she her fruit snacks, eating them with my cousin. I love fruit snacks, guys. I think we have Mott's fruit snacks at Mutual Aid. But yeah, keep on checking in. Hannah said she her favorite meal, acai bowl on the beach. I love a good acai bowl.
Hi, I'm Aaron, he, they pronouns. I think my favorite meal is usually spaghetti with red sauce, not too different. And I have a lot of memories just like eating a whole lot of it. Sometimes when I was a kid at my grandma's house, until like really stuffed, and I guess I like that.
Patrick said he, him. I was gonna say spaghetti too, lol. Yeah, that's a popular one. I think people like pasta a lot. Lauren said she, they. My favorite meal might be tostadas and eating them with my family. That sounds really good too. I don't know what my favorite food is, but I'm still deciding. Zuko said he, him. My favorite meal are boiled crab legs because they're a traditional food in my family. My favorite memory associated with them is eating crab legs and bonding with my mom. Aw, these are all such sweet memories. Okay. Yeah, keep sending check-ins in the chat and then we can move on to our first section on what is escalation. I'm gonna pass it over to Hammer. Yeah.
Yeah, so the first section that we're talking about today is what is escalation? So starting off with the first slide, which we'll talk about like the goal of escalation. If we could go to the next slide, sorry. Okay, yes. So essentially the goal of escalation is to one, increase the threat you pose because that will in turn increase the amount of leverage you have when it comes to your efforts towards achieving your demands. And then second, exerting direct pressure on a specific target, whether that can be like financial, reputation, or even a specific individual if you're pressuring them. And then third, expressing outrage and in our sense, kind of expressing anti-normalization because what's happening isn't normal. And so it's important for us to express our outrage and do that in a way that can also achieve our demands by increasing the leverage we have. And then also showing solidarity with the calls and conditions on the ground in Palestine. I mean, at the start of this call, we just talked a little bit about what's happened most recently in Palestine and in Gaza specifically. So it's important for us here in California to show that we're standing in solidarity with the calls that are coming out from Gaza and the people in Palestine And then finally, one of the goals of escalation is to generate hope by demonstrating power, strength, and determination. And I think this can be really easily seen in the way how a lot of people remember some escalations from the past year, including the encampment, which was an escalation to increase the leverage that students had towards achieving the demands that were put out, but also was able to generate hope by bringing together such a large community of students and community members on campus together, and really demonstrated the determination that we all had together. If we could go to the next slide. So the next slide is a quote from The Escalation of the Global Struggle and Protest. It's the duty of humanity in the face of the war of annihilation. And so it reads, "This brutal war will not stop without escalating pressure on the forces of aggression, raising the slogan of rejecting inhumane racist policies, confronting the degenerate Zionist terrorism, working to dismantle the coalition of annihilation, and upholding Palestine and its cause and the right and dignity of its people as a compass for humanity, a test for every living conscious in this world, and an address for the struggle of peoples to obtain their rights and freedom and defend their existence in the face of murderous systems and the cabal of war criminals." So we can kind of see here that in this like short excerpt, it's kind of really highlighting the fact that it's imperative to escalate in order to achieve these goals that we kind of envision ourselves living in a future where Palestine is able to see freedom and is liberated and is able to like defend itself from the existence of these murderous systems and see itself free from them. So escalation plays a really big role in the overall like global struggle as well. And then next slide, please. So strategic escalation. So escalating should be done strategically. And so it's essential to really thoroughly analyze the conditions that are taking place in to ensure that escalation is the right choice to make, right? And so this can include looking at like the following questions. How will it help achieve the demands or further the movement or cause? And also, are the masses ready for escalation? Looking at these two kinds of questions, it's really important to consider them because sometimes escalation can require a larger group of people, as well as the fact that escalations can oftentimes have an impact on not just the people doing the escalating, but the surrounding community as well. So it's important to consider in the masses as well as what impact the escalation would have when it comes to achieving the demands you've set out to accomplish and the overall movement we're working in, right? So then also, there's the fact that escalation is often followed by an increase in repression and militarization from the state, which will disproportionately impact Black and Brown people, including those who are not involved. And I think we've really seen this clearly here, like within our own community and here at UCLA with the attempts at repression from the administration following the escalations in the spring, right? And these attempts at repression have impacts on not just the people who were involved in the escalation, right, but those who weren't involved. And I think that's a big reason why it's so important to consider why, like, if masses are ready for escalation. And so when it comes to specifically looking at how repression that can follow escalation can impact our community, it's so important to look at what the potential consequences can be for those that are the most vulnerable members of our community, as well as Black and Brown people. So before escalating, it says on here, it's so essential to consider the potential consequences and what we can do afterwards to keep each other safe despite the repression that can follow. And so this naturally applies to both individual and group acts of escalation. Because at the end of the day, there's always going to be some risk with an escalation, but it's so important that we really consider what we can do to keep each other safe, and keep the rest of our community safe following whatever attempts at repression can come up. And then next slide, please. So it's also so important for escalations to avoid being reactionary, right? Because we're not looking to escalate in an immediate response to Zionist or state provocations without consideration of the consequences, our goals, right? We just kind of talked a little bit about being strategic with escalation, right? And so that means not just escalating to react immediately, right? Because at the end of the day, we're not here for Zionists. We're not here to really respond to Zionists either. And we have such limited energy, so we can't waste our energy on them as a community, right? We're here for each other, and we're here in solidarity with Palestine. And I think if we reflect back on this last year, there are many ways in which we can see this. And going back to the week of the encampment, one of the community guidelines that everyone who entered the encampment had to agree to was that we don't engage with counter aggressors, with outsiders. We're not here to address them. We're here for us, and we're here in solidarity with Palestine. And so I think it's really important for us to consider this mindset when it comes to other things that we engage in, and other ways that escalation can be used as a tool to further our demands or further leverage for our demands. And then next slide, please. Okay, and then this is another quote from Huey Newton on reactionary escalation, sorry. And it reads, "Many times people say that our 10-point program is reformist, but they ignore the fact that revolution is a process. We left the program open-ended so that it could develop and people could identify with it. We did not offer it to them as a conclusion. We offered it as a vehicle to move them to a higher level in their quest for freedom, and in their attempts prevent the oppressor from stripping them of all the things they need to exist. The people see things as moving from A to B to C. They do not see things as moving from A to Z. In other words, they have to see first some basic accomplishments in order to realize that major successes are possible. Much of the time, the revolutionary will have to guide them into this understanding, but he can never take them from A to Z in one jump because it is too far ahead. Therefore, when the revolutionary begins to indulge in Z or final conclusions, the people do not relate to him. Therefore, he is no longer revolutionary if revolution is a process. This makes any action or function which does not promote the process non-revolutionary." And so I think this is like a really great excerpt that kind of really demonstrates why it's so important to escalate, but also escalate in a way that identifies the fact that we can't go from A to Z, right? As Newton says in this excerpt. We have to move from step to step, and we have to move the people from step to step to get to the final step of Z, right? Which is what Newton refers to, like the final conclusion. Yeah, this is, I think, a really heavy quote that kind of just really brings to light exactly kind of what we've been talking about so far. Next slide, please. Okay, so now we'll talk a little bit about the Al-Aqsa flood. And so starting a little bit with the conditions. So this happened after 75 years of relentless occupation and suffering, and after failing all initiatives for liberation and return to our people, and also after the disastrous results of the so-called peace process. What did the world expect from the Palestinian people to do in response to the following? And so these are two examples of what has happened before the Al-Aqsa flood. The first being the Israeli Judaization plans to the blessed Al-Aqsa Mosque, its temporal and spatial division attempts, as well as the intensification of the Israeli settlers' incursions into the Holy Mosque, as well as the practices of the extremist and right-wing Israeli government, which is practically taking steps towards annexing the entire West Bank and Jerusalem into the so-called Israel's sovereignty, amid plans on the Israeli official table to expel Palestinians from their homes and areas. And just to take a moment to kind of talk a little bit further about the second point, I think this is something that is still continuing to happen, and it's so important to consider the fact that this has been happening and is continuing to happen. And when these things happen, they're just an expansion of what's been happening in the past and building upon the continued occupation and suffering we've seen for the last 75 years. So next slide, please. So why the operation itself wasn't a reactionary escalation, right? And then I'll read this quote and then talk a little bit. So it reads, "What was expected from the Palestinian people after all of that? To keep waiting and to keep counting on the helpless UN, or to take the initiative in defending the Palestinian people, lands, rights, and sanctities, knowing that the Defense Act is a right enshrined in international laws, norms, and conventions. Proceeding from the above, Operation Al-Aqsa Flood on October 7th was a necessary step and a normal response to confront all Israeli conspiracies against the Palestinian people and their cause. It was a defensive act in the frame of getting rid of the Israeli occupation, reclaiming the Palestinian rights, and on the way for liberation and independence like all peoples around the world did." And I think this quote really kind of demonstrates, one, the fact that it's so important for Palestinians to take the initiative, right? Because we've seen that while this is a right that's been enshrined in international laws, norms, and conventions, the UN isn't an entity that will take action all the time. And in past classes I've taken that have talked about the UN, a lot of the times the very first thing we would do in this course was talk about whether or not the UN was relevant in the 21st century, right? And we can see time and time again in the past when the UN does step in to kind of intervene and when it doesn't, and how oftentimes that can often be at kind of the helm and like the reaction from the West and the permanent 5 members of the Security Council and kind of what they want and whether they want to move the UN in that direction. And so the UN in itself, as an entity, isn't one that Palestine can rely on to protect its rights and to protect its lands and its sanctities. So that's this slide. Next slide, please. So the goal and the success of the operation. So it reads on here, Operation Al-Aqsa Flood on October 7th targeted the Israeli military sites and sought to arrest the enemy's soldiers to pressure on the Israeli authorities to release the thousands of Palestinians held in Israeli jails through a prisoners exchange deal. Therefore, the operation focused on destroying the Israeli army's Gaza division and the Israeli military sites stationed near the Israeli settlements around Gaza. So we can kind of see here how this escalation, like we talked about, was targeted, pressured a specific target, and also considered what their goal and how it would be able to increase their leverage for the demand that they were kind of seeking within the overall larger movement. Next slide, please. So then this is like a really short video clip that we'll just watch all together. Hopefully the sound works.
قتلا وحرقا وحريقا قتلا وحرقا وتدميرا وإغلاقا للطرقات. وأفهم هذا المحتل الجبان أن طوفان الأقصى أكبر مما يظن ويعتقد. يا إخواننا في المقاومة الإسلامية في لبنان وإيران واليمن والعراق وسوريا، هذا هو اليوم الذي تلتحم فيه مقاومتكم مع أهلكم في فلسطين. ليفهم هذا المحتل الرعديد أنه قد انتهى الزمن الذي يعربد فيه ويغتال العلماء والقادة قد انتهى زمن نهب ثرواتكم، قد انتهى القصف شبه اليومي في سوريا والعراق، قد انتهى زمن من راهنوا على تقسيم الأمة وبعثرة قوتها في صراعات داخلية. وآن الأوان أن تتحد كل القوى العربية والإسلامية لكنس هذا الاحتلال عن مقدساتنا وأرضنا.
So that was kind of it on this section. I know there were no subtitles on the video, but yeah, thank you guys for listening to the section on what is escalation.
Thank you, Cameron. Let me start screen sharing again. Just give me 1 second, and then we can start on the section on Palestine National Movement. Okay, so expanding on, I guess, escalation, I guess we need to kind of look back on what the Palestine National Movement is. And so some key concepts to like contextualize is one, popular base of support for the Palestinian liberation struggle. Any struggle for liberation needs a popular base of support within its masses to be successful. Kind of hence like why we talk about the mass line and building like a united front. But yeah, so there are various forms of support actually that include deterring the enemy, producing literature and media that promote the struggle or propaganda, and being actively involved in organizing and mobilizing society. And so we understand that, you know, Gaza is home to a largely refugee population and that the people of Gaza have rejected domination in every form. All tactics except siege have proven too costly for the Zionist state and entity. And so our next term is accumulation or tarakam, and this refers to the advancements made by our people in the forms of experience, learnings, and development of strategies and tactics, historically, which have accumulated to the current conditions and means of resistance for the Palestinian people. And so we see this in like the tactics that are learned over time, and like the symbolism in like different forms of resistance. And so this moves on to, you know, the idea of creative resistance, which is something that Palestinians have to do and continue to practice, you know, whether they like it or not, because of their conditions under the occupation. And then next is material conditions and resistance. It's important to understand that, you know, building on the concept of our struggle not being spontaneous, it's critical to also understand that the way Palestinians fought against their colonization and occupation was rooted in an assessment of the material conditions of the people. And these material conditions of dispossession can create revolutionary consciousness, but that alone cannot sustain the movement. It's important to understand that the Palestine National Movement and like the resistance of the people comes from experiencing those material conditions as well as ideological preparation and ideological struggle. And so we're going to go into a little bit of history prior to the Nakba and understanding imperialism and colonization. So the Palestinian struggle for self-determination and national liberation is one that predates 1948. I know like a lot of us talk about like the Zionist occupation and how it has been ongoing for over 75 years, but it's also important to understand the impact of British colonialism. And so the revolution was born out of a concrete need to liberate Palestine from collective oppression. And because of this, we know that the revolution ebbs and flows and makes strategic shifts and tactical decisions based on material conditions. And understanding like those shifts and tactical decisions also relates back to what we were talking about in terms of escalation. And then like on the last slide, I know it talked about the importance of not being spontaneous, again, like being strategic and being targeted, and understanding that revolution and escalation is not reactionary, but has like a goal is really important. And so understanding like early resistance to the British and Zionist state, we have to understand them as two primary contradictions of this time period, which were Western imperialism and Zionist colonization. And so imperialist interest in Palestine isn't unique, and we understand this through the Sykes-Picot Agreement, as the imperialist powers wanted to access to a land route to Africa and India in order to exploit their resources and get access to that region, further expanding their own colonization. And so by 1935, Zionist settlers actually made up 30% of the country. And during this period, we began to see the British facilitate mass migration of European Jewish communities to Palestine and understand the British mandate to be an occupation of Palestinian land. And so by 1935, 1/5 of Palestinians had become landless, and a vast majority of people whose land was their source of life lost access to that livelihood. And the British regime dispossessed Palestinian land in a lot of different ways, through, high tax rates, driving Palestinian peasants out of their land into industrialized job markets that were designed for settlers, expropriation to Zionist infrastructure, and resources and infrastructure development was constructed to create, created by Zionists for Zionist development. And so we understand during this shift of British and Zionist colonialism, that Zionist imperialism is a source of oppression and is the enemy for the Palestinian people. And that material impact is the loss of land, as well as, loss of livelihood, loss of homes, and everything that is, really foundational to Palestinian life. And the engine of the struggle is Palestinians losing their land. And we understand colonization through the loss of land. And so because of this, it produced the conditions of the earliest depression of the revolution of 36, which I'll talk about in a second. Actually, before we get there, I will talk a little bit about the 1936 to 39 revolt and the struggle against British Zionist colonization. And so in 1936, the Arab Higher Commission called for full refusal to participate in economic life. And it's important to understand the context. I know we talked about last week the importance of Arab nationalism in the fight for liberation, and also the axis of resistance. But the economy came from expropriating and exploiting Palestinian life. The refusal to participate became a big way to protest, hence, boycotts and the movement for BDS as well. And so farmers refused to sell their products or their produce, and laborers went on strike and shut down their shops. And the strike was a mass strike, and so it became very large in character. And labor unions were under British suspicion since they were correctly seen as fronts for political organizing. And so we can see how labor really plays a role in the Palestine national movement and created, grounds for resistance. And then so next I want to talk about is Al-Din Al-Qassam, who was an Islamic preacher and scholar that worked with the masses to raise consciousness against oppression. Earlier, we talked about how it was important that, in the national movement, that both material conditions and ideological struggle are really important. And so his sermons in the mosque helped to mobilize people towards revolution. And he understood that sermons were necessary because the masses were largely illiterate. And he needed to make, political education accessible to the masses. And Al-Qassam programmed his revolt in 3 stages, which included ideological preparation through sermons engaging in popular education that the masses understood, that were accessible, material preparation, and revolt. And so earlier, Hammer talked about, escalation and the importance of preparing the masses and just distinguishing whether the masses are ready for escalation and the role of escalation in the movement. And so again, like he really symbolizes like a lot of that, the importance of organizing rather than just mobilizing. And so the British deemed his sermons as violent and were monitored closely. And of course, like we understand, colonizers will always criminalize anything they see as pushing back against the ideas of the colonizer. And so Al-Qassam's political intervention in Palestine represents a strategy and a vision that is fundamentally different to the approach of the Palestinian and Arab elites of his generation. And what made his work successful was, and his organizing successful, was that it was mass in character, and that he was raising the consciousness of a lot of people in this revolt. And so a lot of the tactics included things like stone throwing that was used back then and is still used today. I'm sure a lot of us have seen the photo of like the Palestinian child throwing a rock at a like Zionist tank. Women played a major role as well. Women, children, and young men would strike in support of the revolution, hence the importance of labor in the struggle. Women strikers were routinely targeted by the British, and it was not as constrained in the domestic sphere, where rural women were also involved in armed rebellion. And so again, like Al-Qassam really represents strategy and vision that was different to the elites, and he believed that the struggle against Zionism was inseparable from opposition to British rule and in the need to reject the route of negotiation adopted by the Palestinian elite, and in the necessity of armed struggle and armed revolt led by Palestine and Arab world's popular classes, which was namely the peasantry and working class. And I know we talked about this last week, and we consistently talk about the importance of class analysis and class struggle, but I think we had like a quote last time that talked about how, the difference between life and death for the peasant and working class is not much. And so they will lead the struggle. And a lot of, the radicalization and the ideological struggle lies in material conditions and understanding those material conditions, which brings us to Gaza as the popular cradle. And the popular cradle is more than just support for action. It is a measure of consciousness and willingness to take action. And we must remember that Gaza holds the history of political struggle. Its character of primarily refugees and proximity of Egypt made it a hot point for oppression. And I'm going to read a quote by Wissam al-Rafidi that says, "Those are the headlines of our times. We're in the stage of retreat and collapse, but we were here before the Intifada broke out, and we will still be here after it is over. The people who made the Intifada and made the revolution after it can renew it with even greater vigor. The Palestinian Liberation Organization may go wherever it pleases, but we will go only to one place, toward our national objective. In order to get there, we must hold on to the only correct and sound logic, that of the revolution." And so this is from Trinity of Fundamentals. I'm going to read a quote, and it's important that we have, again, revolutionary optimism, especially as people who are in the belly of the beast. We can't afford to be pessimistic about what's happening on the ground when the people who are, the resistance that's on the ground is, every day resisting the occupation and the brutal aggression of the Zionist state. So I'm going to read it out loud. It says, "What was once figurative is painfully literal. Bloody beards, furniture and trees, a limb hanging from a ceiling fan, women giving birth on the concrete, cliches cover the terrain, plants erupting through rubble, flowers springing from cement, etc. The surreal happens so much. Journalists are poets, almost, when reporting about the decomposed under ruins. Doctors have invented acronyms for conditions my fiction professors would have called unrealistically, episodic. Death is everywhere. But there is and always has been more to our reality. We are without a doubt subjects of conquest and colonization, products of circumstance, we are also so much more than that. At every turn of our bloody history, we have been brutalized, bereaved, dispossessed, exiled, starved, slaughtered, and imprisoned. But we have, to the world's dismay, refused to submit. For every massacre and invasion there have been, and there are now men and women who pick up their weapons, makeshift and sophisticated, Molotovs, rifles, slingshots, rockets, to fight. There has always been struggle, and there has always been Jasmine. And that's a quote by Mohammed El-Kurd in Rain is Coming. And so, sorry, this part is incomplete, but just kind of talking about, I know we've spoken about it before, and Professor Noor Juda gave a talk about it at People's University in person when we were still on campus. But it's important to understand that the political memory that lies within Gaza and within Palestine and the resistance as well is just the people on the ground. And we understand that everyone on the ground, that Palestinian is part of that resistance. And so Safmood is like this idea of steadfastness that Palestinians have developed through the years and years of occupation and colonialism that they've experienced at the hands of the Zionist state as well as British colonization. And that kind of steadfastness within resistance, and the idea that they will continue to resist regardless of what the conditions are, that they will continue to adapt throughout their experiences under occupation is really important and really inspiring. And that's kind of why we always try to center the ground and the resistance on the ground. And it's also important that we understand that we have to reject the idea that, you know, Palestinians are stronger because they've endured this, and we have to understand that their level of humanity and their level of resistance comes from that steadfastness and does not make them, you know, more I guess more resistant to that kind of treatment and those kind of material conditions, but that you know, their material conditions make them make their ideological struggle and their revolution stronger. And so it's important that we understand that, and that you know, that we have faith in the fact that Zionist entity is essentially crumbling right now. Mariam talked about this last session, but they read a quote from the PFLP and how, you know, the movement for national liberation has been ongoing for so long, and now we're at a point because of the resistance, because of escalation by you know, Al-Qassam of Hamas, that we're able to see that Palestine is on the world stage, and that, you know, liberation is inevitable and that it's coming, and that, you know, like so many people every day are raising their consciousness and becoming aware of what's happening in Palestine and understanding, you know, the relationship between Palestinians and the violent oppressive Zionist entity. And so it's important that our role as a solidarity organization always lies in, you know, raising that consciousness, doing everything that we can in the belly of the escalating in the context of the belly of the beast, to bring forward the movement to the calls from the ground. Thank you, Hammer. And so moving on to moving back to some mood, there's also a reading that we'll send out later, but it's about dwelling, rebuilding, and the people of Palestine. And there's some diagram there about how, you know, Palestinian youth on the ground and design, and that we should now realize that life. So it's really important that we take inspiration from their you know, the steadfastness and combat despair. And so Kaba says that there are times I feel overwhelmed about what to do, or the problems seem so big and so able. In those times, I ask myself questions that serve as guideposts. What resources exist to educate myself? 2, already in the work and justice? 3, do I have capacity to offer to? And 4, how active? Hayes says we users to spend more time with books and other modes of being to claim an inheritance of knowledge. Your precedent and imaginings of organizers who came for us. Oh, hear me? Just not. Hey, can you guys hear me now? Is it still cutting out?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, beautiful. Thank um yeah, I'll just reread the quote by Kelly Hayes. We organizers to spend more time with books and other more modes of learning to claim an inheritance of knowledge your oppressors hope you never discover, embrace, or build from. The stories, wisdom, hope, and imaginings of organizers who came before us. And so that's kind of why we're here. And I know it's the last day of People's University, at least for the summer, of our program, but it's important that everyone shows up. And I'm really glad to see so many people who have shown up consistently. But it's important that we look to learning and we look to elder organizers as a source of revolutionary optimism and as a way to combat despair, especially just because it can be really overwhelming to just like see videos all the time of the atrocities, whether it's in Palestine or whether it's in other places in the global south. And it's important that we don't get desensitized to these kinds of atrocities. And so, yeah, it's always about expanding our consciousness and like kind of bringing that to ourselves and to other people, which is like a role that all of us have, whether you consider yourself an organizer or not, whether you're part of an organization or not. And so, in the face of doom and despair, we must be organizing in collective action. Even if the end times are upon us, we should still plant trees. Some collective care are really important. That's why we have mutual aid. That's why we have, um, you know, free educational resources like this, and that's why we try to encourage people to go to other political education opportunities as well, is because it's really important that we stay grounded through our actions and we live revolutionary optimism should be, I guess, interlaced in every part of our life. And you have to understand that having hope is something that requires discipline as well, and that to be disciplined, members of the revolution and people who are engaged in the struggle is having hope, because it's impossible to continue if we don't have that kind of hope and optimism. But yeah, and I just want to like kind of ground us in the sense that like I know we have mutual aid on Fridays every week, but it's also important to understand that like all of the people who are here in this room today, like we should all be showing up for each other and like have love for each other regardless of like how close our relationships are right now. And it's important that we continue to build those relationships through both mutual aid and through political education and through mobilizing as well. And there's actually going to be an opportunity. I know it's the end of the summer, but for people who are non-students, for people who are not official members of SJP at UCLA, all of you have like the power and like the knowledge that you need to organize and to be engaged in the struggle. And so we're gonna send out an email or like a message later about getting more involved, but I hope that everyone is able to kind of walk away with this understanding that like we really do need to embody taking care of each other and building community with each other and have that revolutionary optimism because um, you know, people on the ground can't afford again like the pessimism of people in the belly of the beast. And if the resistance still has that steadfastness, that soft mood, then so can we. And we can draw a lot of inspiration from how they continue to resist regardless of their material conditions. But with that, we'll move on to our writing and reflection exercise. And I can send the link, and we'll start some breakout rooms. Okay, hi everyone. Thank you for participating in the discussions. I think now we'll go back to, now that we're back in our main room, we can do share backs. So does anyone from group 1 want to share out what their group discussed? I kind of forgot to, Zuko. I think we were in group 2 though. Let me check. Hold on. Oh, just kidding. I guess we were in group 1.
Oh, okay, then I'll share. Everybody was we talked a lot about revolutionary optimism and how about how maintaining land and culture and all that stuff is like really important to maintaining optimism. We talked about how participating in community outreach and like mutual aid and taking action during the encampment and escalating whatever, how that was something that was really key to keeping people going, especially with like with like the genocide raging at the same time. And you know, yeah, we talked a lot about mutual aid, and we discussed like doing we discussed like expanding mutual aid and like how we could improve it to like better better connect with the LA community. So that was some of the stuff we talked about.
Thank you, Zuko. Does anybody else from group 1 want to share back what we talked about? Otherwise, we can move on to group 2. Okay, who was in breakout room 2 that would want to share back?
Yeah, I can share on behalf of Breakout Room 2. We talked a lot about like our role as a small part of a broader movement for the liberation of Palestine and for our collective liberations. We talked also a lot about what it means to like have revolutionary optimism and also like revolutionary grief. Just knowing that our grief is what grounds us, and it is like kind of how we build direction for ourselves, because if we weren't upset with the conditions of both our state in the US and the state abroad, then we wouldn't be empowered to organize at all. We wouldn't feel a necessity for it. So grounding ourselves in that grief and then maintaining that optimism through building community. Yeah, I think that was part of what we talked about. And then just understanding that community is built. It's not something that you'll just come across. It is something that has to be developed and put a lot of like effort and intention into creating together and to grow together. That's something we talked a little bit about. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for sharing back. I think like a lot of people really echoed the importance of like what it means to be in a solidarity organization, and just like understanding like our position and different forms of like, I don't know, ways to build community. But yes, thank you everyone for participating today. And then, I know this is our last like poly ed technically, but People's University will be continuing on during the school year, but it still hasn't been, flushed out in terms of like solidifying what the structure is going to look like, but it will probably be different from how it has been looking like in the summer. But we're going to post some recommended readings later when we publish the slides in the drive that everyone can access. And then I don't think we had notes today, unfortunately, but there will be again like more resources and readings for you guys to access for people who didn't make it. And then not tomorrow, on Thursday we have a tactical. We're gonna be discussing kind of like wrapping up like the summer program. And then there's also a rank and file group that does like self-defense trainings, and they do like sparring, I believe, like 3 times a week. But yeah, make sure to keep an eye out for that. And then on Friday, of course, we have our mutual aid at 4 p.m. on Westwood and LeConte from 4 p.m. until sunset. And then there's like an ask for foot spray for Tony, and then we need a lot of cold drinks and just like frozen water bottles because of like the heat right now. Sleeping bags and tents are always needed, sunscreen, things to just like keep people safe from like the weather conditions right now. But yeah, there's also a new group chat that was just made for mutual aid specifically so that we can kind of discuss how to continue to expand it and make it more sustainable and to meet more people and like to reach out to more people, improve our routes, things like that, and also so that we can make sure that we're connecting it to Palestine in every step that we take in mutual aid. But yes, I can bump that in the chat. But thank you everyone for participating today, and we'll send out more details after this. All right, bye everyone. Thank you.